Hello, my name is Holly Thompson. I am a junior environmental studies major with a minor in pre-law. This is my research day project on communicating climate change. This project is basically doing research and to see what legislation Republicans in Congress can get behind. I used a sample of Congress members in the Senate just because it's small and it's representative of all the 50 states. So to give a little background about why I'm doing this presentation, in 2019, I saw Benji Becker testify to Congress as a young conservative concerned about climate change with Greta Thunberg, who we all know is a very prominent environmental activist. But at that time, we didn't really see many young conservatives talk about this issue. And in order for us to have a good dialogue about what environmental legislation should look like, we need to have both sides. In order to get anything passed, we need both sides. So a little more background into that. Pew Research reports that 59% of Americans see climate change as a major threat, 23% see it as a minor threat, and 6% do not see it as a threat. So there's a large consensus that this is a big problem and we need to find ways to solve it. So, but this gets divided when we see that 90% of Democrats think that the government is not doing enough, but only 36% of Republicans don't think the government is doing enough. So, what are some things that Republicans can get behind that actually will help the planet and the economy and everything that Republicans also stand for, with obvious compromises? So, this brings us to my methodology. How did I go about finding these legislative things and how to communicate them? So first, I looked at senators' policy priorities on their websites, and I copied and pasted them into a Google document to see really what they cared about. And then I also looked over how to communicate the problems to people who don't realize that climate change is an issue. And most of these things I took from a little bit of personal experience, as well as some research. Then we need to look into why people aren't supporting this environmental legislation and where the research is needed in the future to try and get information to present to Republicans in Congress and why they should support this legislation. So now we get to the results of my research. So after looking through the senators' priorities and finding the words that come up most, I found a result is that energy was really important to the priorities of these senators. After that, it was agriculture, protecting resources, which also can go with conservation, water, and protecting those resources, and also jobs. Obviously, jobs are really important to Republican senators, especially because they don't want any industries in their states to kind of die out, which is one of the problems we face when trying to tackle climate change with the coal and oil industries. But this gives us a starting point of the kind of topics we want to focus on when coming up with bipartisan environmental legislation. So then we get more detailed into energy. Most of the senators were talking about energy in general and how it can be more resilient for the American people, as we saw in Texas. It wasn't great with the infrastructure kind of crumbling when it got too cold. But this is important because a lot of these senators also saw the energy crisis that happened in the 70s, and resiliency in the energy sector is really important to them. The problem was oil and gas did come up a lot, but there was hope because a number of the senators talked about green forms of energy, whether it's wind, renewables in general, solar, nuclear, even if they didn't talk about them as much as they talked about oil or gas. There is room to improve. Okay, then I want to talk about some past and present bipartisan legislation. So a lot of this is really important because it shows us where in the past we have been successful in passing environmental legislation. The Antiquities Act basically allows a president to conserve land, whether it's national parks or state parks, things like that. The president can preserve a large amount of land and water, and this has been used from presidents who are both Republican and Democrat. Another bipartisan legislation is the Clean Air Act. So a lot of these pieces of legislation go with something in society that caused such an uproar or was so bad that Senate and the House had to legislate. So with the Clean Air Act, it came around 1970, which was the first Earth Day, and that's where millions of people marched in Washington because there was visible smog in many cities. And people were dying, it wasn't good, so that's what caused this legislation to come forward, and that's Clean Air Act was the most bipartisan legislation. And one of the most bipartisan pieces of legislation in American history. Then we get to the Clean Water Act. It passed with a vote of 366 to 11 in the House, which is unheard of. And at that time, 1/3 of the rivers were unsafe for swimming and fishing. So this kind of goes with the environmental push in the 1970s with the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. Americans were upset, and a lot of the media attention was on these issues. The other thing is a lot of this bipartisan legislation is not really heard in mainstream media. An example of this is the Great American Outdoors Act. It had bipartisan support to fix the backlog at the national parks was getting to be issue with coronavirus and government shutdowns. And also the Great American Outdoors Act was co-sponsored by both Bernie Sanders and Mitch McConnell, which is also unheard of. And then we get to Energy Act of 2020, and this goes back to the American people wanting this sort of legislation. So Pew Research says that 83% of Americans say increasing renewables is a top priority for energy policy, and this was the first energy policy renewal in 10 years. Okay, then we get to how to communicate climate change and the real issues to these senators. So when looking for wording, climate change was only talked about 20 times in all these priorities, which is not good. And if you look at global warming, it's not even heard of. Sea level is only mentioned twice, which is some of the big things with climate change and how many people often communicate them. But the thing is, the senators do realize that things are happening with the environment and there are a lot of issues. So climate was mentioned 87 times, flooding, hurricanes were also mentioned, and a few of the senators' priorities, there are even whole pages about hurricane resilience and hurricane help and things with flooding, natural disasters. So we see that they're really happening in states like Florida and Texas. So the senators realize they're happening, but don't always admit that it's climate change. So then this gets to the conclusion and next steps. So the best things we can do are to make cases for how environmental legislation can benefit the environment and also the economy. That goes with sustainability model of being good for the economy, the environment, and social and society. So ways we can further develop this is do research on what jobs come up with the renewable energy sector and how it compares to the oil industry and if there are more jobs. there, as well as the economic benefits of past bipartisan legislation like the Clean Water Act, which have been reports that it is very profitable. Then we get to agriculture, promoting that and supporting small farmers and working with legislation around that, because the agricultural industry is a big contributor to climate change. And also, to get to the third, instead of taxing polluters, we invest in green technology as well as mitigation efforts, because all the senators, from going through their priorities, have a very big emphasis on infrastructure and what they can bring back to their home states. So that's something they were very proud of. And if we invest in infrastructure and technology, we can get to a point where we can have a green economy. Then we can focus on states and the senators that are more likely to face natural disasters, such as the ones in Florida, Texas, that have hurricane information on their website. We can also focus around the senators that are already doing good things with the environment, such as the ones on the environmental committee, and the senators that actually realize that climate change is an issue and say it openly in their campaigns. And then one of the important things we can do is shut down the scapegoat that the Green New Deal presents and acknowledge that they believe it is unreasonable, and we were willing to work with them and compromise them on real solutions that we see here, such as energy, agriculture, and conservation. Thank you.